This is episode 348 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can sign up to support the show and get insider extras at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzgerald with the School of Irish, Celtic Studies and Folklore and University College Dublin in Ireland. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The Marshal or Veterinarian has a workshop, which is a self-owned place which he uses to store all the tools and instruments that he needs to work with. That's where he stored his animals too, at his house, because the workshop, it was the place where he would live as well.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Shakespeare's plays mention horses over 300 times across his works, reflecting the huge place in the everyday lives of people that this animal occupied. For something that was so essential for travel and for work, it makes sense that a horse owner would want to make sure their horse received the best of care. The art of horse doctoring in the 16th century generally fell under the purview of the blacksmith, who was responsible for the horse shoeing. The word for practicing medicine on animals for the medieval period was known as Marshalcy in English, and it comes from the word menescalia in Catalan. Today, they are best known as farriers. Our guest this week, Carmel Ferragud, is an expert in the history of veterinarian medicine and especially the history of Marshalcy. Today, he joins us to discuss the activities of the 16th century farrier, what kind of medical care was available for animals in the 16th and 17th century, and exactly what a veterinarian would have been like for Shakespeare's lifetime. Dr. Ferragud is Catalan, and while Dr. Ferragud speaks fluent English, his accent is very heavy. And to make the conversation clearer over audio for our American audience here on the podcast, we're working with a Catalan translator this week. As I ask the questions in English, you'll hear Dr. Ferragud's answers spoken in Catalan and reply in the background. But our translator will be brought to the forefront to speak it in English as we go. The full transcript of our conversation, if you're interested in reading the full Catalan version of his answers in print, will be available in the regular show notes for today's episode. Carmel Ferragud is professor of the history of science at the University of Valencia in Spain. His research is focused particularly on the Catalan culture during the Middle Ages, especially the models of care in several municipalities. He's looked at the sociological study of medical and veterinarian practitioners. His publications include some monographs and more than 70 papers and book chapters about medicine, marshalcy, falconry, alchemy, magic, and astrology in the late Middle Ages. You can see more about Dr. Ferragud as well as links to his work in the show notes for today's episode. Before we dive into our conversation with Carmel today, I want to let you know that there are visual history elements that coordinate with our show available inside the detailed show notes for patrons of That Shakespeare Life. You can see illustrations of 16th century farriers, medieval bestiary images of marshalcy, the practice of caring for horses, along with other special bonuses from museum artifacts and paintings to primary documents and research articles. Find all of these things by clicking the Access the Detailed Show Notes button on the regular show notes page. There, you can join us as a patron or log in if you're already a supporter of our show, and the extras will expand right on the website. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 348. And stay tuned after the episode when I'll be back with more details, and I'll share that URL for you again one more time after our conversation. For now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Carmel. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello.
Did the occupation of veterinarian exist for Shakespeare's lifetime, or were the duties of caring for and medicating an animal given to someone like a farrier or the blacksmith who would have been doing the horseshoes?
Well, the
occupation of a veterinarian doesn't appear until the 19th century as we know it today, with studies in schools and later on in universities. There's a slow transition towards a veterinarian craft that will face the diseases of animals as we humans would do for ourselves with laboratory medicine. During centuries, there were various individuals that took care of animals' health, some in a professional manner, like the veterinarian blacksmiths, which achieved a very high reputation. Really, the origins of the veterinarian craft in the Middle Age, in the times of Shakespeare, it's found in the blacksmiths, which they were provided by a medical and empirical background, and they would end up specializing more and more in the cure of the horses, the mules, the donkeys, up to the point where they would become reputable professionals amongst specific sectors within society, especially in the urban sector. Some authors make a clear difference between the known albaiteria in Spain, specifically in Castilla, and the menescalia, which is known like that in the area of Aragon within the Iberian Peninsula, really in all the Mediterranean area, and the rest of Europe, the north of Europe. The Arabian influence and the reputation of the albaiter, they did have a strong influence over the Mediterranean territories, differently to the north of Europe. In fact, there's a lot of texts that state this difference, the difference between the south and the north of Europe. There is another influential character other than the blacksmith or the veterinarian, for example, the farrier, who was in charge of placing braces on the horse's teeth, and this was very important. There were many kinds of braces, and these would stop the horses from getting diseases. It was as important as the horseshoes. We could say that the horseshoes, as well as the braces, they had a therapeutic role. A veterinarian actually could make them and use them. This is why, over time, it became a really specialized craft. There was a confusion, actually, during the Middle Age between what the veterinarians and the horse dentists could do, not only in the Middle Age, but in the times of Shakespeare. And actually, the names were interchanged many times as farrier menescal or menescal farrier, which would be dentist veterinarian or veterinarian dentist. This happened too in the case of the surgeon and the barber, which it was called barber surgeon, which was a name that worked in a similar way, and that it indicates an economical and social evolution. So the evolution from the farrier to the menescal, or we could say from the dentist to the veterinarian, is in fact stating this social progress. This in fact allowed for the creation of a theory around their art. In fact, there was a literature coming from ancient ages, which was properly developed throughout the Middle Ages. However, it's worth saying as well that there were books to explain how to attend other animals, like dogs and falcons, which had their own experts towards that field. As I was saying, the urban world was possibly the space in which the veterinarians had the most presence, reputation and formation, as there were knights, there were nobles, there were ecclesiastics. But it is true as well that I've been able to find many veterinarians working in the field, in the rural world. Actually, it would be very good to build a map which could show the veterinarian practitioners of Europe, but this we don't have really. Furthermore, it's interesting to take into account that there were many other ways to heal the animals. For example, from home. People had an empirical knowledge on how to treat animals, and this information would transcend from generation to generation. But when there was not enough knowledge on how to cure an animal, then people would just call the veterinarian, which would come home to attend the animal. The big owners would be able to keep texts. They could preserve many texts, like agronomy texts, and these would allow them to attend their animals. And many of these texts were translated to every single language that was not Latin or coming from the Latin, like the Catalan, Spanish, English, French, Dutch, all of the languages. Finally, I would say that there were the pastures. The pastures would know how to attend their animals. It is to expect that they wouldn't know how to read or to write, but it is true that there is an information that goes around about how the pastures have to attend their animals. Therefore, is a more complex world than what it can look like.
És un món més complex del que puga semblar.
In Shakespeare's lifetime, human medical science operated off the principles of Galen, believing the balance of the four humors to be the source of all health and healing. Carmel, when it came to healing a horse or healing some of these other animals, like the falcons that you mentioned, would farriers or the marshals have relied on these same Galenic principles for animals?
El galenisme en
Well, the
realidad
Galenism
impregnaba
would
todos los
actually
ámbitos de la vida.
have a strong effect in all the parts of life of everybody. Every kind of person in any kind of social condition would understand what the Galenism was and how it worked. The Galenic principles, in a way, would dictate how people would live and how would societies live, how a city would live, right? It was the motor, in a way, that would orchestrate all the acts. People could have a more or less deep knowledge about it. Like now, people talk about medicine and they know only what they know, right? But we all know a little bit about it, and we know a few names about this field. For example, the preachers, when they would give their sermons, they would use the humoralism to talk about sin and about virtue, because everybody could understand them. This way of understanding sickness and health and to practice medicine was present until the 18th century, meaning after Shakespeare times, the Galenism was still present. However, we have to say that there's other forms of knowledge more scientific for them than for us, as it is magic and astrology, that they were part of medicine. They had a role. For example, the use of prayers, of amulets, of talismans to protect the animals, they were really used. There could be found a blend between the scientific content and the content more based on miracles or beliefs. In a way, for example, the influence of the planets upon the living beings, there was a reality that everybody would accept and understand, and that everybody would have to take into account when trying to cure an animal as well as a person. But a person that would try to cure a horse or any other animal, and that would have certain understanding of the Galenism, but they would use to manipulate the four humors that would compose every single living organism. It was about a complex theory, highly speculative, that we don't have time to explain today right now. It is possible that in one of your podcasts you could find it, because the list of what you've done is really long. Right, and as I say, horses, like in the case of people, they had a complexion that would manifest in a humor that was dominant. In the horse's case, it was interesting because you could see that in the hair and in the skin of the horse. You could see it in the color. The humors were manifested in this way, and they would appear registered in this way in the veterinarian treatise. Well, this would allow everybody to know the character qualities of the animal. And it's worth saying that a really important mission that the veterinarian had, it was to select the mares and stallions to make them reproduce with each other. So they would treat these question about how to breed horses. Therefore, these had a really big relevance on the senior courts. The nobles wanted to have the best horses, the prettiest horses, the most appreciated horses, which used to be the Andalusian horses, the Spanish horses. Therefore, they would look to create a high-quality breed of horse. This was common in the Shakespeare time, not as much in the Middle Age, but in the Shakespeare time. In fact, in the Spanish case, this was legislated. It was necessary to have the best animals, and this is why not all the mares and stallion would be able to pair with each other. Well, in short, what I would say is that what these veterinarians would do, it was to maintain the balance of the humors, avoiding for them to get stale and stuck, and to improve their fluidity, looking for the way to keep the health and to cure them. Furthermore, there were ways of diagnosis like the uroscopy, the urine of the animal, and the observation of the stool of the animal, and even from the blood. Because of looking at the signs of these leftovers, the veterinarian was able to determine the diagnosis, what was the cause of the disease, and to act. As well, they would be able to correct flaws of the animal, certain behaviors that were not adequate. For example, if the animal wasn't walking well, or wasn't breathing well, or what was the position of the head, right? So therefore, this is a little bit of the therapeutic nature that these veterinarians would do, managing the interior medium of these animals, of these humors of these animals. And as well, at last, I would say that these veterinarians would manage a health regimen for the animal. Like, how did you have to have the animal? How did you have to feed the animal? How the animal would have to sleep? The hygiene, the volume of work that could do, the resting time that would have to do. All of this was important to keep the health of the
mantenir la
animal.
salut d'aquests animals.
You mentioned that they would apply amulets or
Talismans.
talismans. Yes. What's an example of an amulet or a talisman that they would have applied to a horse for medical reasons?
Un dels...
Right, so, well, this was very common as well in the human medicine, right? The doctors, when they would treat specific diseases, they would use as well, the university doctors, the most reputed doctors would use these kind of objects because they would have hidden properties. They would understand that any natural object would have a series of things that were positive or negative, like the precious stones, like the gems, the ruby, the emerald. They are stones that have certain virtues, like the gold is really, really used in medicine because it is, the gold is a perfect element. It is an element that from the alchemy point of view, which is another important element, it has certain properties that if you manage to pass them on throughout the specific manipulation to the person or the animal, you are helping them, right? There are specific gems and precious stones that can be applied to specific problems, like the kidney stones. It's a possibility, like that's one of the things you can fix, but there's many things you can fix. But then there are prayers as well. Prayers that are used to heal the animal. This is really, really common.
Això és molt habitual.
Did people bring their horses to the marshal, or would the marshal travel around to different farms and see the sick animals where they were located?
Val, nosaltres tenim diferents situacions
we have
al respecte.
Different situations here. One is the marshal or veterinarian has a workshop, which is an self-owned place which he uses to store all the tools and instruments that he needs to work with. That's where he stored his animals too, at his house, because the workshop, it was the place where he would live as well. At the cities and at the villages, many operations would be done not inside but outside of the house. Why? Because we're talking about animals that are really, really big, like horses are really big, but the operations that would be done with them, like taking blood out, the bad smells, the flies flying around, it was a really, really loaded atmosphere, really stinky atmosphere. Therefore, they would try to keep the air fresh and circulating, moving. But people would complain a lot about this because, one, they could not walk in the street. It was a toxic environment, right? That's why in many cities, they would regulate the places where they could do these kind of operations. For example, there are some cities that they would take them next to the river. They would force the marshals to work next to the river, getting them away from the people, right? This is, as you could think, all these activity, it tends to be moved outside of the city. Another space, it could be the palaces, the king's palaces, the court spaces. There, the marshals would work under a salary. They were hired by these high society people. And in these stables, they would do their activities. For example, this is found everywhere, but there's places where it's really documented. Like, for example, in the Italian cities, They were really popular, the horse races. There was even a racing circuit in all the cities. Therefore, the nobles, they had a big interest in investing in really, really good horses to win these races. Therefore, their marshals were really good at finding the best animals to participate in these races. But furthermore, there was a taste that started being developed towards a specific horse. Do you know the story about the Man of Vitruvi by Leonardo da Vinci? There's a standard of proportions for the horse. The horse has to have a specific image, and this has to be achieved with a specific choice of the horse. Therefore, the influential men wanted pretty harmonious and strong horses. And all of this was done by the marshals, but at the houses of those influential men. Another really popular place is the hostel. The hostels were places where people would end up after a long trip. So there was a lot of circulation in hostels, and therefore the horses would get there tired and sick. And what was necessary, it was the horses could rest and get fed properly and taken care of. Therefore, there were marshals as well in the hostels, right? As well, we've seen that takes importance the bath for the horse. The bath, it was a galvanized therapy. Therefore, it was created as well a bath for the horse. And so that to be able to heal them in this way. And as the marshals started having more knowledge about other animals, then they would have to move around different farms and different country houses where there were different animals living with their owners, and then the marshals had to go to visit them. For example, in the mountains, there's a lot of people that used to be living in the mountains, and the marshals had to go to visit them. This has been happening up to really recently. We've seen it in Valencia, for example.
Aquí a València ho he vist.
Please give us some examples of 16th and 17th century records of specific kinds of medication that would have been given to horses, and what kind of ailments were these treatments used to treat?
Val, com hem parlat abans, el galenisme
right,
és...
as we've spoken before about, the Galenism is the explanation thought through and scientific that they would use to intervene upon the horses. The first thing, based on the Galenism, that it's important to do when there's a sick animal or a person is to change their food.
Of course.
Actually, the line in between the medication and the food is really thin. It's not easy to distinguish between the two. In fact, the treaties that were written down, they would give information about the qualities of the different foods and drinks.
Dels diferents aliments I les begudes. D'acord?
Well, didn't they just eat grass and grains? I mean, how do you change what a horse eats?
Tu pots utilitzar... Vaig a donar-te un exemple.
You can use... Well, I'm going to give you an example, that it's called the talbina. The talbina is a medication food, let's say, that it was really common, for example, in the Aragon area in Castilla. And I don't know if it made it to the north of Europe, but it consists of a kind of like an oatmeal-looking food that mixes flour, cereal, milk, honey, and saffron as well, the spice, right? So with this you make like a dough and you feed the animal, especially during the winter, because it is a really thick and consistent food. Therefore, you take out the usual foods, which is the oats, the barley, and the cereal, and then you give the animal this. Meaning, well, there is an explanation, let's say, Galenist, a moralist, about this food. This food recomforts, regenerates, it invigorates the animal. And they would do this kind of change in their diet, or even they would ration the food, but it's about controlling what the horse can and can't have. Right, we know that the horse is a herbivore, right? As you said, it can have specific things, but they learned the way to feed the horse in a different way to help them and nourish them. But when this was not enough, it was necessary to go to the medicines. Therefore, there's a big range of medicines that could be given to the animal, right? There was a big diversity. They would use what it was known as simple medications, and then they would combine them to create complex medications. Complex medications could have dozens of ingredients. It was a complicated thing. In fact, this wasn't done by themselves. This was done by the apothecaries, right? The old pharmaceuticals, to say it in some way. Because to elaborate a medication like this, it implies to have a certain knowledge of this kind. It implies to have knowledge of mathematics, because it's important to graduate them in a specific proportions that the Galenism would give. This is an Islamic and old pharmacopoeia, which was inherited in the Latin context, and that it was diffused and that it was sophisticated over time. Therefore, it's not easy to elaborate a mixture like this. Doing from simple medications, it's important to have really clear this theory of scaling the different products, right? There were many instructions, for example, on how to induce the vomit of the horse, the urine flux, to empty the bowels. There is medication of many kinds: diuretics, narcotics, caustics, suppuratives, right? The range is really wide. But as you see, what it tries is to expel the noxious humors, right? To take them out of the organism, right? This was done throughout organic ingredients, like normally plants were used. And over time, as we move into the modern world, like the Shakespeare times, there were used medicines that use mineral elements, like, for example, the sulfur and the mercury. And there was a big variety of ways to show these medicines. For example, there were ointments, there were powders, there were beverages that can be inhaled, they can be taken orally. There's many, many ways of doing it. Therefore, there is... the way to intervene over the horse, it can be very
La manera d'intervenir sobre un cavall pot ser molt variada.
I'm assuming the Islamic pharmacy was coming out of Turkey. Was this something that was followed in Europe? Because I know there was a lot of, we'll say, argument between like the Ottoman Empire and England during this time. Would farriers or marshals in England and Spain have been consulting those notes on like amounts and how much to give?
Has de pensar, Cassidy, que hi ha
you have to
una
think
llarga
that there is a long tradition since the times of the Crusades. The Christian world gets in touch with the big volume of knowledge that wasn't existing before for them. It was in the hands of the Islamic world.
Okay.
A good part of the Galenism, it comes from Arabic translations. The Occidental world didn't know a big number of texts that were in the Arabic hands. And the Islamic world itself develops in Arabian a way of writing that is not only about copying, but they amplify that knowledge. Therefore, through the Iberian Peninsula, through Sicily, the entry of knowledge, first from the area of the Crusades in the holy grounds, but afterwards from the south of Europe, there's all this knowledge coming in. There is a point of contact between the Christian and the Islamic world that is really powerful. Therefore, there's an appropriation of this knowledge. In the Mediterranean is stronger in those centuries, but all of this, in a certain way, starts taking more importance in the way that the texts would be written afterwards.
En els tractats que s'anaren escrivint posteriorment.
Well, we've talked about nutrition and specific medicines that would have been given to horses, but what about surgery? Was surgery ever performed on horses? And if so, what kind? And were they successful?
Bé, efectivament, la cirurgia va ser molt practicada.
Surgery was really practiced in different ways and forms on horses. When I say horses, I refer as well to mules, donkeys, etc. Right? But it was really risky, as it happened with humans. It was the last resort, to say it in some way. Why? Because there was a life risk based on which surgery was practiced, right? Sometimes the problem, it was so serious that they would use the surgeons as a resource as well to intervene over the animals, because they have more ability when practicing delicate surgeries. But I have to say as well that sometimes the marshal would intervene over people. They would act as doctors because in many places there were not doctors. So they would have to use the marshals, right? Or whoever was available there to cure a human. Well, the thing is that the surgeries that were practiced, normally they were external surgeries. The internal surgery was scarce and not really recommended. Amongst other things, because the anatomic knowledge of the horse, it was really rudimentary. It was really basic, right? So usually the wounds, the suture, the phlebotomy, or the therapeutic bleeding, which it was a really used operation and a therapeutic practice. This was done really, really often. To burn a wound with fire, for example, it was done with animals, with humans. This would allow for the humors to get balanced and to extract corrupt matter through the blood. But horses would be wounded often in wars or at work, so you would have to heal them. But the internal surgeries were not really recommended at that time. Right. There is a surgery that I can explain to you because it was really practiced and it was really surprising for the researchers. It's done on the tail. In Spanish, it's called the punishment of the tail. In Catalan, it's called to touch the tail. What it's about is to cut the nerves of the tail to stop the animal from moving it. Why would they do this? Nowadays, it would sound crazy to do this, right? But in the Middle Age, it's possible that it was related to the war. Really, I don't know. It's to stop the horse from getting entertained and moving. So in this way, the tail stays still and it's not distracting for other horses. In the courtly world, in the Shakespearean world, it's a matter of respect. Because a horse that moves and shakes the tail, it's showing you it's arse, it's anus, and this is ugly, and therefore they wanted for the tail to cover the anus of the horse. This surgery is risky. Actually, I wrote a book about a case like this in Catalan. It was a book that talked about a horse that died because of this surgery. And I found that in Castilla, there's a similar case that was published as well. And it was published because they killed a horse because of this surgery that they considered normal, but that it was in fact risky, right? Well, this is an example. For us, it can look like a barbarian practice, but you've asked me about the success or the failure of therapy like the surgery. But this is a problematic question from the point of view of sciences and medicine's history, because the categories from which they operate and we do, they are not the same ones. Let's explain. How far could the knowledge and expertise of a marshal, right? What could a marshal do on a horse? Like a doctor, could a marshal cure the horse of any kind of disease? Was it easy? Right. You have to think about one thing. In the end, everything in these times, in this time period, it depends on God's will. So it's God who guides the hand of the marshal as it guides the hand of the doctor. If the animal dies, it's because God wanted to, not because the marshal was not capable enough of curing it. But it is true as well that from our standards, the Galenism would be an absolute failure. Because, for example, the Black Death, right? People would die and there was nothing that could be done. The Galenism couldn't do anything about it. But people wouldn't expect for the doctor to cure everything. But instead, they would expect the doctor to diagnose and do a prognosis of when someone would die. Well, in any case, what's interesting about this is that either in humans as in animals, we've found complaints of bad practice, like the one I told you about the correcting of the tail, right? This means that they thought as well that a person would need to have special knowledge and would have to act with special expertise. and it was expected from a doctor or from a marshal. But there were many cases in which the animal would die and the owner would sue the marshal, right? This would happen more than a patient suing a doctor, right?
Que un pacient denuncia a un metge, d'acord?
Did the marshals treat other animals besides horses? I mean, you mentioned a couple of other animals that would have fallen under this heading. Were they just taking care of people's freight animals, or could you take your dog or your cat or something to them?
A veure, esta és una qüestió...
Right. This is a question that we've been thinking a lot about because we don't really have a clear answer for it. In fact, there's not a lot of studies or research on it because the documents don't really clarify this information. On the Middle Age, we have suspicions that that could be the case. But what it's clear is that during the 16th and 17th century, the marshal starts taking more medical responsibilities on other animals that are not horses. For example, cows and oxes. Why does this happen? I think that on one side, the cavalry starts not being as relevant for armies. So in a way, the marshal starts looking for new clients other than the horses, because if there's not as many horses needed for war, you need to look for new animals. So that could be an explanation to amplify the kind of animals that the marshal would work with. On the other hand, there's other problems. The herd animal, like sheep, this has been studied a lot by David Saving, who is an English historian. The spread of diseases is really fast, so animals die and there's nothing that can be done. So what's the purpose of a marshal, especially with animals that are not really valuable? A horse is really expensive, but a chicken or a hen or a sheep is really, really cheap. So it's not worth it to do the effort to cure them. But aside of this, as you said, people knew how to cure them. I'm going to give you a specific example. In the classic agronomy books from Rome, it's talked about the petita, which means the small one. The petita is a skin that it's found on the hen's tongue. Women who took care of hens, they would tear off that skin, otherwise hens would die. I know that in Valencia, women would still be tearing off this little skin from hens a few decades ago, right? So this is a knowledge that has moved over different generations and that it has not been necessary a specialist or a doctor to cure these animals, right? But as I say, we can guess that there are indeed animals that started being more and more interesting and treated over time. Furthermore, there's other news that have been really interesting and not really studied, which indicate that these animals had their own value. There was an interest in detecting the origin of the diseases, and different necroses have been found, which are autopsies on animals that are dead, but not only on horses and mules, but as well in hens and sheep, because people wanted to know what was the cause of a disease to try and cure it and to avoid it. But this is a field really, really studied. And there's another thing that I think that you will like, the attention towards the exotic animals like lions.
Like monkeys?
Lions.
Wow, okay. From where?
This is a bit scary, actually. The matter is that we've detected recently that the marshals could cure lions. Look, all the royal courts had a collection, a zoo with really, really weird animals that would come from Africa. They would even have giraffes. But they had as well buffaloes, camels, but especially there were lions. The lion was the symbol of the royalty. Right? So therefore, in the crown of Aragon, which is the field that I know the most, the Jewish people were the ones in charge of curing the lions, of paying and taking care of the lions. But when they were sick, they would look for a marshal. And there's a really interesting case of a lioness which was sick, that couldn't breathe, and they went to cure her. How? I don't know. I don't know how they could touch a lion in that time, but we have this registered in a document. They would hire a marshal that went with the Jewish person and show him the sick lioness that had to be medicated. I know as well that some lions, they had to have placed an enema. It's a really crazy situation. I can imagine how they would keep a lion still while they would put an enema in his anus, right? That's crazy. Well, in any case, you see that the range of activities that they practiced grew over time, and I think that the research will show us more and more over time about the practices of these people.
En un futur de aquests individus.
Well, what was the process of training to become a menescal? Did you have to go to school or university, or did you have to do an apprenticeship, or do you just get nominated to handle some of these really weird situations?
Ja, bé, en la major part dels oficis...
For most crafts related with the health, human and animal health, the process was learned in a domestic way, home, someone else's home, which would be at the marshal's home or at the doctor's home. Back in the Middle Age, there were not many doctors at universities, so there were just a few doctors at universities. In the Middle Age, we have to say that in the modern age, the number of doctors at universities started increasing. But back in the Middle Age, doctors didn't really study at universities, and you couldn't find any marshal at universities because the veterinarian craft wouldn't exist until the 19th century. Before then, it was only learned home. Right. In the area that I know the most, which is the Mediterranean area, this was done with a notarial contract. So you would go to the notary, and approximately during 4 years, you would commit yourself to learning the craft and being the servant of the marshal. When you finish this period, you would have the knowledge, and that's what you would earn. You wouldn't earn any money. Let's say that the payback was only the knowledge about the craft. But sometimes, over time, the knowledge about writing and reading is more and more requested because, as I said, the treaties over the martial craft, they're more and more abundant over time. And you can read them in your language, not in Latin because you wouldn't know, but in Catalan and in English you would. Therefore, this was a craft that it was more and more important for these kind of people, right? What happened once they learned their craft? Well, so on one side, that they had to pass an exam to have the license. There were established some tribunals where you had to go to take an exam. This in Castilla and the Crown of Aragon has been happening since more or less the half of the 15th century. This is the moment in which they start regulating the access to the martial craft. There is a tribunal that tests you with an exam, and then they give you the license if you pass it. This was the way to practice instead of opening a workshop, because this was limited and because you would need money for this. And without money, you couldn't. So many of the marshals would leave and work with other marshals that were richer because they had those kinds of resources. If you had more money, you could open then your workshop, but otherwise you would work under a salary instead of and not as teachers, right? Therefore, if there were exams, logically, it was important to know how to read and write. You would need to know that art, right? It's important to have this in mind, that the martial craft, it's an art that at the end of the Middle Age, it has been more refined and it has been more legislated who can practice it and who cannot. And I'm going to add another thing, two things, if you allow me. One, the slaves. Slavery is very important in this time period. And we know that the marshals had slaves, competent slaves that would know how to cure animals, right? These slaves would be sent to cure the animal, to help to move a horse, because the horse is really big and you would need many hands to move it. Therefore, for marshals to have slaves, which sometimes would even be more competent than the owner, it was really normal. And finally, there's a important detail. I haven't been able to find a woman that was a marshal. I've never been able to find a single one in this time period.
No n'he pogut trobar mai cap en aquestes èpoques.
Never, it was never a woman?
No.
That's too bad. I think we'd have been good at it. Well, I thought I was going to learn about horses, and now we've looked at medicine, surgery, and even lions in zoos. There's obviously a whole world of veterinary medicine history to explore here. And in addition to your article on Marshalcy that I will link to in the show notes for today, what are some of your recommendations for where we should begin if we're new to this area of history and we'd like to learn more?
Bé, el problema és que has convidat...
The problem is that you've invited an author that has only written one thing in English about this subject.
So you'll need to translate, but that's okay.
I've written a variety of articles and one book specifically about this subject, particularly about the Middle Age in Catalan, right? And let's say if your audience is interested, you can pass on this information that you know about my work. But it's true that there are different authors that in this moment in English, they are working and doing very interesting things. There's a young guy that works at the University of Leeds, if I'm not wrong, who's called Sani Harrison. And he has written a few really interesting articles about these kind of questions. Then there's a Greek author called Stavros Lazaris, who writes in English and French. Mm-hmm. And his work focuses especially in Byzantine hippiatry, right? Ancient hippiatry. It is really connected with everything that we've been talking about. These authors are really interesting. Harrison is really young. He's doing really good things. And there are really good books as well about the subject. I would recommend you a book called Animals and Courts, which was published in the year 2020 by The Greeter. And it's a marvelous book. It talks about horses, but it talks as well about lions, leopards, ostriches, birds, any kind of animal that would be in palaces and how they would be attended, how they would be taken care of. So there are many, many interesting things out there. In our field, there is a doctoral thesis which is focused on a book that talks about the martial craft that is really important by Manuel Diaz that was a bestseller. It was translated to many, many languages in Europe. And then a doctor called Gloria Ribugent is about to defend. So there's a lot of things. Some are in English and some need to be translated if you want to read them. But there's plenty of literature about the subject out there.
Si vols llegir-les.
Thank you so much for these recommendations. I love that they're from many countries and in multiple languages. That's exciting to explore. And we will link to all of these resources, including Carmel's work and others in the show notes for today. So make sure you stay tuned through the URL for where to find those. Now, Carmel, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Bé, això és complicat. Esta
right.
És una pregunta difícil.
This is difficult. This is a difficult question.
It's supposed to be.
Very difficult question. Right. I would say that there's many authors that I love and in many languages. In English, I would say my favorite one is Ian McEwan. I would say I've read all of his novels, so I wouldn't choose one. In my language, in Catalan, I would say the complete work of Joan Fuster. Joan Fuster was a brilliant essayist who wrote in Catalan all of his body of work, and he writes about so many different subjects, and he's so good because you will be really, really thinking about a lot of things constantly because of his writings. And I would say as well, maybe the Bible would be one of the books that I would take to a desert island.
També me l'enduria, si poguera.
So you're going to take the collected works of Ian McEwan and Juan Fuster, or are you going to pick a specific one of their books?
Home, és que Joan Fuster té un munt
Joan Fuster has a lot of good books. There's a beautiful one called Dictionary per Ociosos, in English, Dictionary for the Idle, right? And it is like a little lovely dictionary, basically.
Okay.
Right? Fantastic, lovely.
Fantastic.
I think that would be a good choice for your deserted island for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
A veure, la veritat és que jo soc un historiador.
The truth is that I'm a restless historian. I'm a restless researcher, right? I love to do many, many things. I have many interests. Currently, I am collaborating with many more historians, and I would recommend 2 things that you can check out online and that maybe your listeners would like it as well, because they are partially in English. You can find it in English as well, which is the Corpus Medicorum Catalanorum, MedCat, which I coordinate with my colleague Luis Tifuentes. It is a medical corpus about the Crown of Aragon, which is huge. There's thousands of documents, right? This is not translated to English. It is in Latin, in Catalan, and in Aragonian, but not in English. But well, there's a lot of information in it. There's people from around the world that accesses it. And another one that maybe would be interesting for you because it's more tied to your subject is falconar. Falconry in the Middle Ages in the Crown of Aragon. And it is in English. It is translated to English. And it is an informative website about the falconry, right? These are 2 projects in which I am working currently with Ricardo Olmos, a friend that did a doctoral thesis about the subject. There are 2 really powerful subjects because they are really demanding and they take a lot of time and work. But as I explained to you, I like working on different subjects. I research about alchemy, astrology, but especially I research on human medicine on the 14th and 15th centuries, which is my main subject and what I focus on. Middle Age human medicine in the Crown of Aragon.
Medieval en la Corona d'Aragó.
Well, that sounds exciting. I know we'll look forward to seeing what you discover with all of that research. Thank you so much, Dr. Carmel Ferragud, for being here this week to share with us the exciting and intricate history of horses, exotic animals, veterinary medicine, and just so much more. This has been really fun exploring this piece of history with you, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here and share it with us.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
As I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the list of resources and recommendations we've been talking through today, along with the transcript of our conversation, so you can see the Catalan version of Dr. Ferragud's answers and more information about our guest and their work, particularly the article that our conversation was based on today about taking a look at the history of Marshalcy in the 16th century, is all linked in the regular show notes for today's episode. You can find these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 348. That's CassidyCash.com/EP348. Remember, while you're there, if you want to expand the bonus visual history content and more in-depth research about this topic, to click the detailed show notes button available on that page to log in as a patron, and you can access all the insider extras. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 348. That Shakespeare Life is written and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. We're grateful to Steve and Katie Sanders, Paul Sobich, and Tim Cash for connecting us and supporting the translation work for this episode, and give a special thank you to Pablo Mirmir Araño for providing the voiceover translation from Catalan to English. It was a team effort this week, and we truly hope you enjoy being connected with premier history research being done in Barcelona, Spain, and having that brought to you for today's episode. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.